If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius-level mathematician, and you want to do that for, or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. There's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later, and they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. we've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right. If you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. If you write a book, which is virtually impossible, and then get a publisher, which is virtually impossible, you probably have a rejection rate of 99%. So then if you do manage to publish the book with a reasonable publisher, which you won't because it's impossible, then you get 8% royalties. That's it. So 92% of your labor goes to the sales, marketing, and distribution end of things. And so it's very, very difficult to generate capital as an entrepreneur, and there's innumerable impediments. One of the things that people do, and this is something for those of you who might be entrepreneurially minded, here's another thing that you have to understand, is that you can't really create a product and then launch it, because first of all, you don't know how to do that. You might know how to create the product, but you do not know how to market or sell it. You don't know how to advertise it. You don't know how to communicate about it. You don't know how to ship it. Like, there's all sorts of things you just don't know. But worse is, you don't know if people will use it. And so what companies do that roll out new products on a relatively continual basis do, is they don't develop the product and then go sell it. They continually communicate with their customers about what product the customer is willing to buy next, and then they develop that. And so you have to have your market identified, and then you have to be in continual communication with the market while you develop the product. It's not, I build a better mousetrap and the world comes, marching to my door. That isn't how it works. Is that you got to find out if someone wants to buy your stupid thing. And then the next thing is that even if you have a great thing, you're going to go talk to people and they have 50 great things that they might buy, and they're all great, but they're not going to buy all 50. They might buy one, maybe, and maybe they'll buy it this week, but probably they'll buy it in 6 months. And they're not going to buy any of them, no matter how great, unless they're on fire and you're selling water. Because they're so busy already right? They're so overwhelmed and preoccupied by their jobs that if you come in and you say, well, here, this is going to increase your efficiency by 20%, and here's the 3 weeks you'd have to spend doing that, and then the payoff would come in the next years, they'll say, yeah, well, I'll do that as soon as I have time. And as soon as I have time is never. So if they're on fire and you have water, you can sell it to them. But that's all, because otherwise it's a no-go. So those are all things that are worthwhile knowing, because they're very hard to learn. And so, and very comically, I mean, if you would have told me when I first started developing these tests that one of the reasons corporations wouldn't buy them was because they worked, that I would have just thought, really? I mean, come on, really? That's really the reason? It's like, yeah, that's the reason. God. So very, very, very problematic. And then they already have their processes in place, and they're entrenched. And then the next problem is, you know, you haven't got any customers. I think I told you that before. You don't have any customers, and you show them the statistics, but they can't understand the statistics, and they also have 200 other people selling them things, and 50 of them are crooks, so they're just lying about what they're doing, and they can't tell the difference between the liars and the people who are telling the truth, and so they can't understand the statistics for themselves, and they can't verify them anyways. So what they ask you is, who else is using it? And if the answer is, well, everybody, then you don't even have to do the sale because you're already rich. And if the answer is nobody, then they're going to say, well, why is nobody using this? You say, well, it's the hottest thing that's come along. And they think, well, I'm not going to be the sucker who gets painted, you know, red and fired because this failed. That they do not think this might make me succeed. People do not care about whether or not they succeed. They care about whether or not they fail. And so that's another thing, is that if you're marketing something and you can say, this will stop you from being identified as a failure, then people might be happy about that. But if you say, this will really help you succeed, it's like, yeah, no, I don't want to succeed. I just don't want to fail. I don't want to succeed. I just want to be invisible and be left alone. And if you're looking for people's fundamental motivation, that's it. It's they want to be invisible, and they want to be left alone. I tell you the zebra story? Any of you know that story? Okay, I'll tell you this zebra story. Stop me if I've told it to you before. This tells you everything you need to know about human beings. So it's worth knowing. Okay, so zebras have stripes, and people say, well, that's for camouflage. And then you think about that for 2 seconds, and you think, that's a really stupid theory, because lions are camouflaged, and they're like golden like the grass. And zebras are black and white, so you can see a zebra 5 miles away. It's like, there's a zebra, it's black and white. So the whole camouflage thing, that's just not working out so well as a hypothesis. Okay, so biologists go and they decide to take a look at some zebras. And so they're looking at a zebra on the herd, because there's no zebra, right? Just like there's no fish. There are schools of fish, and there are herds of zebras. There isn't a fish. This is why I think the cod aren't coming back. There are no cod. There are massive 100-mile-long schools of cod, 10 stories deep, 20 million years old. You wipe out the school, you don't just get to throw a cod in the water and say, well, you know, off you go. It's like, well, where's my city? It's like launching you in the middle of a field. It's like, well, go out there and reproduce. It's like, no, that's not going to happen, you know? So without the school, there's no cod, and you can't just introduce a whole school of cod because you don't have a whole school of cod. So, you know, maybe the cod are never coming back. And zebras are the same thing. There's not a zebra. There's zebras. And so you're looking at the zebras, trying to study a zebra, and you look at the zebra, and you make some notes, and you look up and you think, oh, Christ, which zebra was I looking at? And the answer to that is you don't know, because the camouflage is against the herd. And the black and white stripes. There's a variety of reasons for the stripes. Flies also seem not to like the stripes, but you know, usually things evolve for multiple reasons. But anyways, it's very difficult to parse out a zebra against the herd. You look down, you look up, it's like, uh-oh, all those damn zebras look the same. Yes, the camouflage is effective, but it's against the herd. All right, so then you think, well, we better identify a zebra so we can see what he's up to. So then you take your Jeep, and a can of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and you drive up to the zebras and you paint their haunch red a little bit, put a nice red dot on their haunch, or maybe clip their ear with a cattle clip. And then you stand back and you think, hey, I'm pretty smart, now I'm going to watch that zebra. So what do you think happens to the zebra? The lions kill it. Right, because lions, they're smart, right? Hunting animals are smart. But they have to identify a zebra before they can organize their hunt. They can't just hunt the whole herd. They have to pick out a zebra. And so maybe it's like a zebra that's got a sore hip or something. And so you think, well, nature's kind. It just takes the weak. It's no, zebra or lions like really healthy, delicious zebras. But they look like all the other healthy, delicious zebras, so they can't get a bead on them. But if they're small and just born, or if they're limping, or there's something that identifies them, then the lions can pick them out. And then they do pick them out. And so the rule for human beings is keep your damn stripes on so the lions don't get you. And I'm telling you, man, if you want to remember one thing from my class about human motivation, that's a good thing to learn. People camouflage themselves against the herd, and they like to be in the middle of the herd, which is what fish do, by the way. If you have a big school of fish, the smart, healthy, large fish are in the middle of the school. Because you know what you call fish on the outside of the school? Bait. Right. So that's what people are doing. They're trying to move into the middle of the herd all the time. And the herd moves around, or the school moves around, and people are going, well, I'm in the middle. I'm staying in the middle here. So I've got this protective ring of people around me so the predators don't pick me out and do me in. So, okay, so that's part of the reason why I said, well, you can't sell something to someone for success, because you know, you're thinking, well, people are aiming at success. Don't be thinking that. It's not by any means necessarily true. Trait neuroticism is a powerful motivator. And trait neuroticism is, let's not be too threatened or hurt. Right? That's the negative emotion system. And the negative emotion system is a killer source of motivation. You know, you also see that there are scales of well-being that have been designed, mostly by social psychologists, which means they're very bad scales most of the time, because their psychometric capacity is absurdly low, generally speaking. So what you find with scales of well-being, sometimes they're talked about as scales of happiness even, is that people aren't after happiness, they're after not hurting. It's not, so they don't want to be extroverted and enthusiastic, right? And bubbly and full of smiles and laughter. That isn't what they mean by I want to be happy. What they mean is I don't want to be anxious or in pain. And so well-being scales tend to be something like emotional stability plus extroversion. But the big loading is on emotional stability, the reverse of neuroticism. You want to avoid suffering. You don't want to be happy. You want to avoid suffering. And one way to avoid suffering is not to let the lions gnaw on you. And one way of doing that is to stay in the middle of the damn herd. And so, like, I'm not being a smart aleck about this. I understand why people do that. There's real danger to being visible. There's real danger in being visible. Now, you might be successful if you're visible, but you also might be dead. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, you know, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, you know, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well, then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. You know, because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. You know, maybe you're, I don't know, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, you know, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you know, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the third mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to... That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release, and the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it, and if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that the positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion. Because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you, you know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife. And see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And so, and you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue, no, this is true. It's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story, you're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
You know, one thing about the dopamine system that's so important and also explains a lot of pathology, but also a lot of human evolution, is that we have basically one major reward system, which is the dopaminergic system. You know, I sometimes like the analogy that, you know, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar-backed dopamine or it's euro-backed dopamine or Bitcoin-backed dopamine, in the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. And so too, the potential for mates, the potential for food, how much food you have, you know, how much meat you have stored in the freezer tells you a lot about your security and well-being for you and your family, right? And that is translated into a dopaminergic internal representation of how safe and secure you are, et cetera. So this system of fear versus confrontation taps directly into the dopaminergic system. And there's a beautiful set of studies that were done in the 1960s, published in the journal Science, as you know, one of the top journals to publish in. Again, this is not work that I did, but where they gave people, human beings, the option to stimulate a number of different brain areas, just sitting in the clinic. And some brain areas would evoke feelings of drunkenness, others would evoke feelings of anger, others of sadness, others of sexual arousal. And the area that these subjects all preferred to stimulate the most, in fact, they would just sit there and lever press pretty much all day long, was this midline thalamus area. And the subjective feeling that they reported, I find this interesting and would love your thoughts on this, is one of mild frustration, anticipation of something, although they didn't know what.
Yeah, anticipation.
And it's this idea, I think, that it's tapping into the dopamine system. And the dopamine system...
Well, the dopamine system says something good is going to happen.
That's right. The key...
It says something good is going to happen. Something good is going to happen. And it's an appetitive state in some sense, because it doesn't signify the acquisition of... It's not satiating. Right. It's appetitive.
That's right.
And so it drives you forward. And you might think that being driven forward would be unpleasant, but if you're, in some sense, if you're activating the systems that drive you forward voluntarily, then that's the most positive form of positive reinforcement you can have. I think I read animal researchers who said that when they watched animals who were bar pressing to receive stimulation in those brain areas, the animals would look forward as if something was about to appear that they wanted to have appear.
Incredible.
So that was part of that apprehension. Part of it's a hope system in some sense. Right? It's the elicitation of hope.
That's right. You know, it's dopamine, and here I'm robbing words from others, like my colleague Anna Lemke, who, you know, it's not about having, it's about wanting. It's not about pleasure as much as it is about craving and motivation and drive. And something critical about the...
And Panksepp called it seeking.
Yeah, brilliant. I never met Panksepp. Did you? You met Jaak?
I met him. I met him online. We were in we were in a neurological chat room, so to speak, for a neuropsychological chat room for about 5 years, and I had a chance to interact with him a fair bit in that. So that was really good.
I'm envious. He's done beautiful work, and thank you for calling people's attention to his work. I know you've done that many times, and such key work. The dopamine system is in touch with the autonomic system, sure, because it has to register success versus failure of some pursuit. The prefrontal cortex is actually part of the dopamine reward system. People often overlook this, and then we just think about nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area. But the prefrontal cortex, because as you pointed out before, it is generating possible outcomes, different rules, different selves are being projected into the future. You can think that the 2 marshmallow task, the classic, give kids the option to either have a marshmallow now or wait and have 2 marshmallows, and the cute little videos of the kids in the room with the marshmallows, sniffing it, talking to it. Occasionally a kid will just stuff it in his mouth. Another child will turn away, delightful, right? And all sorts of ideas have come about how they do in life versus if they can wait or not wait. In any case, that's dopaminergic anticipation. The key thing with dopamine, I think, that encapsulates the most of it is this notion of reward prediction error, which is very simple. If you are excited and anticipating something, you are generating some internal sense of the probability of it happening. We're going to the ice cream store, kids. Let's go. We're going to have ice cream. We're going to have ice cream. It's closed. The disappointment that they experience actually brings them far lower than they would feel, much more sad than they would feel than had you not told them you were going to get ice cream, which speaks exactly to what you were saying, that it's an anticipation signal. So dopamine's going up, we're going to get ice cream, and then no. So it drops below baseline. They would have been better off being not told they were going to the ice cream store. Just drive right by it.
The danger of hope.
The danger of hope. If you anticipate that it's going to be open, and again, this could translate to any scenario, and it's open, there's a dopaminergic signal upon receiving the reward, but it then drops a little bit. This is the basis of addiction, actually. Drops a little bit below baseline transiently. So we always think of the ice cream is the reward. Well, actually, the reward was right before you had that first lick of ice cream because you know you're going to get it. This is also true of sexual behavior. It's true of people who sell a company or they're anticipating something exciting, or of a wedding. It also sort of partially explains this notion of postpartum depression, where people are so excited about something, the delivery of a child or something, on the arrival, and then for some reason they feel let down. It's because the anticipation was that great. So many scenarios.
It might be an exhaustion component there too. Right. Well, it's also the case, if I remember correctly, that dopamine kick. So imagine what it does is backtrack the neural systems that were activated as the reward was approached. So then it feeds back reinforcement, not reward, but mediates cellular growth and maybe myelinization. It's increasing the efficiency of the neural connections of the systems that were activated just prior to receiving that reward in the order they were prioritized. That's right. In the order they were manifested. So the closer the behavior is to the receipt of the reward, the more it's reinforced and more likely to be manifested in the future. And then there's a decay function going back in time. So, and that's partly how an addictive subpersonality can grow too, right? Because you can imagine that there's a certain state of mind that you're in. Maybe it's a state of something approximating nihilistic hopelessness that grips you every time you're motivated to seek out your favorite drug. And that's fairly far back in the activation chain, but it's there every time you take a hit. So what happens is the dopaminergic reinforcement produced by the drug reinforces that nihilistic hopelessness that drives the drug-seeking behavior. That's right. And that's how, in part, you develop a monkey on your back.
Yeah, I love the example, even though I'm sad that it happens for people. I love the example because what you're saying is that, and it's exactly right, that the memory for events and states of mind and emotions that preceded a successful collection of reward or arrival at reward is set into a huge number of motor commands, some of which are subconscious, and
right.
And the ultimate dopamine signal. Actually, I experienced this the other day. I can give an example. My girlfriend and I decided to go to the beach. We were going to go do this little ritual that we've been talking about doing for a while. And I had on a piece of paper what we had written out we were going to do, and I had it in my back pocket. And we got to the ocean, and the sun was setting. It was sort of perfect timing for this, and the piece of paper was gone. oh my goodness, how did I screw this up? Like of all the things, I'm supposed to, I've been, I'm 47 years old. This is not like I should be able to do this, that
Get your
I
act
blew it.
Yeah,
I blew it. So I went back to the car, long walk, looking everywhere. It was not a windy day, but I thought, gosh, where's this piece of paper? Looking around, didn't find it. Went all the way back to the car, wasn't in the car, came all the way back, and I was walking toward her. I saw her and I thought, okay, this is really embarrassing. I'm gonna just have to wing it or remember. We didn't have our phones intentionally either, so we couldn't look it up. And then I saw the piece of paper on the beach and it was partially buried in the sand. I picked it up and I was elated. What happened there was my dopamine had dropped way below baseline because I was disappointed that I'd lost it, disappointed in myself, et cetera. And then I found it.
Right.
And
right.
so
your anticipation was for nothing.
Exactly.
So you got punished by yourself for that.
Exactly.
Because that should be eradicated. If you're highly anticipatory and it doesn't make itself manifest, then you were seriously wrong. So you're going to take a emotional hit as a consequence of that. I think that's also associated, that emotional hit, that pain that you feel, I think that's actually associated with the beginning stages of the death of the systems that mediated that initial response. Because you should eradicate systems that make you anticipate that don't work, right? And that means those systems, which are already instantiated and alive in some sense, have to decay and die. And it strikes me as highly probable that you're going to pay a price in something approximating pain for the death of those malfunctioning systems. It's also because why wouldn't they fight for their lives to some degree? Why wouldn't they resist the decay and death that might be necessary to keep you going? Why? There should be some pain associated with that logically, because it is a biological transformation.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to a lens to view it through. That self image that I had in that moment of, I'm the responsible partner who can take care of a simple thing, right? For this nice little ritual that we'd been talking about doing for a while. I failed, right? So that part.
Well, it's also so interesting. You think about that. This is a depressive cascade, and it's very hard to bind, because imagine you anticipate something and then you make a mistake. Now the question then becomes, how significant is the mistake? And one view of your error would be, well, the paper blew out of my pocket and that could happen to anybody. And the more catastrophic interpretation would be, and it's an extension of the thought path that you started to walk down, well, I'm near 50 years old, I should be much more responsible than this, and there's something wrong with me as a person. And then a depressive person would go even further. They'd say, well, not only is there something wrong with me in this decision, this is a decision like every other decision I make right now. I never make a good decision. In the past, I've never made a good decision, and there's no way I'm going to change in the future. And so the depressive takes that punishment response, let's say, that's a consequence of failed anticipation, and can't bind it. It just takes out all of their potential future selves. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so then they're in a depressive pit.
Yeah,
so that's too much learning from failure.
Right. I'm really I'm grateful for your insight on this, because indeed, if I'm honest, my thought train went to the point of I didn't think, I'm a total failure because I lost this piece of paper. I thought to myself, well, if it were a priority, I would have ensured I wouldn't have lost it.
Right.
She'll interpret it as not being a priority. Like, where are my priorities? Am I overspent? Like what's going on? You start to sift into the full set of questions. And then, of course, finding the paper resurrects the sense of self. It was, I think it was in that movie, Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, well, that binding problem is really tricky, because so there's some good rules of thumb for that, which is one of the rules of thumb for that's extremely useful, that's socially instantiated, is innocent until proven guilty. Right, so you might say when those thoughts come up, because they're adversarial and accusatory thoughts, you might say, well, that is part of the realm of possibility, but I shouldn't. When your child does something wrong that's minor, you don't say you're a rotten kid, right? You bind it. You say, look, kid, here's a bunch of things you're doing right. But in this particular example, specific situation, here's the minimal thing you did incorrectly and how to alter it. And it's a really good habit of mind. It's like to address towards yourself as well as to other people, which is to say, well, what's the minimum crime that I'm responsible for in this moment? And that's part of this miracle of the presumption of innocence, and especially without proof. A lot of what I did in my clinical practice to people who had a depressive temperament was help them make a case for themselves. It's like, well, maybe you're as bad as you think you might be, But maybe not. Let's take the contrary argument. Let's make you as innocent as you can be in this situation and only narrow the repair to the absolute minimum that needs to be manifested.
Agreeableness is a very difficult personality dimension to understand, I think, partly because it's difficult to dissociate from neuroticism and as well from extroversion. Because agreeable people like you, and so that kind of sounds like extroversion, and disagreeable people sound like they're hard to get along with, and they sort of are, but people who are high in neuroticism are hard to get along with too, and they tend to be volatile and irritable. And so most of the time, if you're engaged in a contentious issue with someone and emotions flare, it usually has more to do with trait neuroticism than with disagreeableness per se. So what I'm going to do is try to describe to you what the agreeable trait is on both of its dimensions, and also to lay out the pros and cons of existence on that normal distribution, trait normal distribution, at more or less every point. Because I think, the way I look at it anyways, is that of all the traits, agreeableness is the one that seems to come with the most marked positive and negative aspects, features, let's say, so we don't confuse it with aspects, the most positive and negative features at each point on the distribution. It's a very complex, seems to be a very, very complex dimension. So I'll read you some of the questions from the Big Five aspect scale, and that'll give you kind of an initial rule of thumb estimate about whether or not you're agreeable or disagreeable. And so here are some of the questions. Imagine that you're answering these for yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first question is, am not interested in other people's problems. So if you are interested in other people's problems, that tilts you towards agreeableness, and I believe that's agreeableness is divided into compassion and politeness, which also sound like very positive things, right? Because everyone wants to be compassionate and everyone wants to be polite, and so you might say, well, is that a virtue? Are those virtues, with the other end being actually negative, to be not compassionate, not polite? It's certainly worded that way, and that's actually a mistake, because we know that these traits are normally distributed, roughly speaking, right? And that means that there has to be positive and negative features at every single position on the distribution. And so to make the presupposition, for example, that being extroverted is being better than being introverted, or that being emotionally stable is necessarily better than being neurotic, is to make a confusion of moral obligation with trait position. You have to assume that there's advantages and disadvantages all the way along, or the distribution wouldn't have set itself up that way, especially because these seem to be biologically instantiated traits. So anyways, if you're interested in other people's problems, they like to unburden themselves to you, you care about it. That's a mark of compassion. If you're more or less indifferent to other people's stupid problems and you wish they just get on with it, then you're less compassionate, you're harsher and more, well, at the extreme, more callous. Let's see. Respect authority. That's politeness. That's part of agreeableness. Rarely, let's see. Feel others' emotions. Compassion. Inquire about others' well-being. Compassion. Can't be bothered with others' needs. Take advantage of others. That's disagreeable, obviously. Sympathize with others' feelings. Avoid imposing my will on others. Wait for others to lead the way. Okay, I think all of those were associated with trait agreeableness or disagreeableness. So let's think about this for a minute. So I'm going to tell you how I conceptualize agreeableness. The first thing you want to know is that women are more agreeable than men, about half a standard deviation. And that's approximately enough so that if you took a random male and a random female out of the population and you tried to guess who was more agreeable and you guessed the female, you'd be right about 60% of the time. So, but what's interesting about that, and this is something also to keep in mind, is about normal distributions, you know. So imagine you have a normal distribution so that most people are in the middle, and then you have another normal distribution, male and female, and mostly they overlap. But you see out here and out here, They don't overlap at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, no, at best this is, at worst this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. Okay, now so you kind of understand that. Now the advantage to being agreeable then is that you're good in teams and you're very much likely to give other people credit. The downside of being agreeable is that you're not very good at putting forward your own interests. And so one of the things that predicts salary across time, for example, is agreeableness, and it predicts it negatively. And so it's part of the reason why women get paid less than men. And this is something for the women in the class to really listen to, because how you get paid across time depends on a very large number of things, right? It depends on your skills and your abilities and your position and your social network and all of that. But the other thing it depends on is whether or not you actually go ask for money, or maybe that you don't even ask, because actually you don't ask for money. You tell people that you need to be paid more, or something they don't like will happen. And I don't mean as a threat. I mean that you have to be willing, when you're negotiating, to have an alternative. You go talk to your boss, who isn't going to give you money, because everyone wants money, right? It's a competitive game. You're going to have to go there and say, look, here's what I do. Here's why it's useful. Here's why you have to give me more money. And this is my opportunities if you don't. And then you're not taking your boss's money anyways, because it's very frequently the case that he's working for a whopping big company. But he needs an excuse to give you money, because everyone's asking for money all the time. And so you have to put your case forward powerfully and disagreeably. Now, you don't want to do it too disagreeably, because then he's going to think that you're a son of a bitch, and maybe he's not going to give you anything, and maybe you'll get fired for being mouthy and all of that. And that certainly happens to people who are too disagreeable. You got to get the balance right. But it's definitely the case. And the other thing that happens to women that's also worth noting, and this is probably because they're higher in negative emotion, is they tend to underestimate their own utility in business settings, right? Because if you're trying to evaluate what you're like, and you're more tilted towards negative emotion, then the things that you do that are wrong are going to stand out more on the foreground than the things that you do that are right. So if you go into a negotiation and you're uncertain already because you have self-doubts, and then you're agreeable in the negotiation, what's going to happen is that you're not going to win as often. And winning in a business setting or in a career development setting means more opportunity for promotion and more revenue generated. Now, the downside of that, of course, is as you climb the business hierarchy is that you also have to take on more responsibility. And that responsibility is sometimes unpleasant as well, especially to people who are agreeable, because you're not necessarily liked if you're in a position of authority. And agreeable people really like to be liked. It's their primary motivator, because they're concerned about the maintenance, I would say, of intimate, positive relationships. And that also makes them conflict avoidant. You don't know what's possible, and you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. And it's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but like, well, they're alive, you know, that's something, and they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it, you know, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it, might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And it's so, that sacrificial issue is so important, because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out. And the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices. And what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently, that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So you move from the unbearable present to the ideal future, and you can't help that. You have to live in a structure like that. That's your house. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you want to get your house in order, and if you want it to be a place that you can live properly, then you have to plan the future that is perfect. And then I think, well, what does that mean? And it means it's good for you. Right? And one of the things that I do all the time with my clinical and consulting clients is try to figure out what would be good for them. But we do more than that. We try to think, okay, well, how can we set this up so it's really good for you, and that all the side consequences of that are things that are good for other people. And so, because people are often also timid about trying to get something that's good for themselves because they feel that it's selfish or that they don't deserve it. So we set it up so that, well, look, we're going to set it up so that it's plainly obvious that this will not harm the structure of the universe. For you to have what you need and to do it in a way that's of benefit to other people, there's no downside to that. And so it's okay. It's okay if you reach out and take that. And one of the things that's interesting about the biblical stories, the Abrahamic stories as well, is that God doesn't really seem to be opposed to the success of the people that he's chosen. What happens to them is, as they progress through their journey, is they get larger flocks, and they get more authority, and they get life more abundant. That's what happens. God doesn't seem to be a miser in the Old Testament. It's like if you put in the effort and you accept the covenant and you make the sacrifices, then you get to be successful, and maybe successful beyond your wildest dreams. And that's actually seems to be okay with God, and that's pretty cool, given that that general notion of. But again, it seems to me that that's very good news, and that you also don't have to be perfect in order to have that happen. And then the other thing, this is the issue about going into the unknown. It's like, well, if you leave your country and your kin and your father's house, and you go out into a land that your intuition guides you to, you're going to undergo these radical transformations. This is a sacrificial transformation too, because you're moving forthrightly and voluntarily into chaos. Right? And that's the same as the dragon fight. That's the hero's story. And what will happen there is that you will transform yourself. And so the call to an ideal is also the call to a sequence of deaths and rebirths that move you closer and closer to the ideal.
So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life, tragedy tainted by malevolence, and what that poses a problem. And the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness. Not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You can drink 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that
casual, impulsive pleasure seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. So people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. People moralize at older people, moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility. You should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, until you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what, you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to take on, to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great.
One of the things Solzhenitsyn said about hedonism, he said, the doctrine that life is for happiness is invalidated by the first sound of the jackboots kicking in your door. And so then the question is, well, what do you do in the face of suffering when your philosophy is hedonic, is hedonistic? And the answer is collapse. And that means that happiness as an aim is shallow and weak. It cannot withstand suffering. Obviously, because when you're suffering, you're not happy. And if the purpose of life is to be happy, then when you're suffering, your life has no meaning. And then if you're suffering and there's no meaning in the suffering, then you're really suffering. That's really hell. But then you think, and this is something that's really heartened me. I talk to my audiences, especially to the young men. I say, look, first of all, don't aim at being happy, because that's just not going to work, especially when the storms come and barbarians are beating at the gate. You can just forget about that. And there's going to be times in your life where you're suffering so much you can't believe it. And so you're going to need something a hell of a lot more robust than happiness to get you through that. And then you might say, well, what's more robust than happiness? Or maybe even what's more robust than pain? And then you could say, well, how about adventure? How about adventure? How about we go out and sail the uncharted seas, you know? How about we go and, Jesus, I talked to a guy the other day. He's a driver for me down in Nashville, where I am, ex-military guy, special forces guy, tough as a bloody boot, now works as a cowboy out in Montana, you know, a real character, perfect bloody American archetype. He knew he wanted to be in the special forces when he was 5. So I talked to him for like half an hour trying to figure out what motivated him, you know? And he told me probably 10 stories about his life, all very colorful and deep anecdotes, battle and rescue and physical privation and discipline. And every 10 minutes he said, I was looking for a new challenge. And then I was looking for a new challenge. And then I'd already done that, so I was looking for a new challenge. And for him, life was nothing but a sequence of impossible mountains to climb. And that's exactly what he wanted. And that's what I think we all want. You know, in the story of Abraham, when Abraham is perfectly happy in his father's tent, eating peeled grapes and, you know, having his diapers changed, even though he's 80 years old. And God calls him out to adventure. And it's very catastrophic, right? Because Abraham encounters tyranny and starvation and war and conspiracy to steal his wife and his own proclivity to lie cowardly. And this is all like that's his first sequence of adventures. And you think, well, what the hell's going on here? It's certainly not the case that God called him out to be happy. And I think the right moral to draw from that story is that God, so to speak, has called us out for something far greater than mere happiness. So much greater than happiness that happiness pales in comparison. He's called us out for the adventure of our life that's of sufficient moral integrity to justify the suffering. And that's something. And if you tell people that, if you let them know that, you know, well, that makes them stand up and cheer, eh? Because deep in their heart, they know that's true. They're hearing that spirit of adventure calls you to be a patriarchal despoiler of the planet. And that demoralizes young men. And that's, of course, exactly the point, because demoralized young men aren't oppressors, although, yes, they are. And they're not despoilers of the planet, although, yes, they are. And so happiness, it's like, you know, that's just happiness is a side effect of moral venture, you know, and if it comes along, you should be bloody thrilled. But as an aim, it's for narcissistic 3-year-olds as an aim. I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea, this is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update, because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this has also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women, because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that the solution emerges. And I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. So if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual. Because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing. And so all you have to do is give up your resentment and your hatred. I know that's a hard thing to give up because you have plenty of reason for it. That's probably a good place to stop. So it was a pleasure. If you don't know who you should be, pick something. Pick something. Pick something that would be an accomplishment. Even do it somewhat arbitrarily, because you know, maybe you have too many choices, you don't know what you're interested in. Start somewhere, aim at something, do it. Maybe it's a 6-month certificate at something. Maybe it's an online course. Whatever. Pick something. Work hard at it. See what happens. What'll happen is, well, you'll get more disciplined as a consequence of the work, and so that'll make you a somewhat different person. But also, as you work on it, you'll figure out in more detail why it's for you or why it's not. And then when you make the next decision, you'll be more informed. That's how a self-correcting cybernetic system works, essentially. You establish an aim and you move towards it. As you move towards it, you gather information. That may shift your aim, but you have to move towards the aim.
So in essence, even if you don't accomplish what you set out to do, that the lessons along the way, that is the higher lesson at some level.
Yes, well, and you, let's say you should try to accomplish it, but I say, let's say, well, you get halfway through it and you think, I really know this isn't for me. Then you might say, well, how do you know you're not just copping out?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, you can set up a check against that by swearing when you start something that you won't switch it except for something more difficult. And then, because, you know, everybody has that tendency to rationalize their procrastination, and that's a good way of protecting yourself against that. It's like, I can quit this, but I have to have a better plan that's more difficult, and I can jump into that. And this is also associated with something like the necessary minimum of respect for tradition. If you pick a goal, it'll be a goal that's a social institution of some sort, virtually, with virtual certainty, because it has to be valuable to other people to be valuable, generally speaking. You don't want to be so cynical that you stop yourself from pursuing anything because nothing's worthwhile. That's not helpful. And everyone knows that. And you might say, well, I can't get out of that cynicism. And I would say, well, jumping out of the cynicism may be very difficult,
try just doing something local, just pick something. You know, if you don't have a relationship, make a dating profile. You don't even have to put it online, but at least you have the profile. You're taking a step in that direction.
Look, last night, you know, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, you know, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, you know, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. When my clients first come to see me, one of the things I often ask them is, okay, well, let's say you look a year ahead. What do you want? What are we aiming at? What would your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be, or at least partly that way? Then we aim at that, right? And we look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing, and we develop strategies, and we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. All right, to understand the categories of myth, we'll say, we have to understand something about the nature of categorization. Now, categorization is a tricky thing, and we're going to run through some complicated ideas relatively quickly. You know, you think you put things in the same category because they're similar, but the problem is that, first of all, that's not an answer. It's just a restatement of the initial proposition. And second of all, you can put things in the same category that are by no means identical, and you often do that. And third, it's things that are similar are often also importantly different, and so picking which element of similarity, you know, like let's say you have a group of books. Well, are they the same? Well, obviously no, because, well, unless they're, you know, all the same book. But the category of books is a pretty strange category because the content of the books differs completely. Well, you could still make a group of books, and you pick some arbitrary element that unites them and consider that grounds to make a category. There's other categories, more scientific categories, and scientific categories tend to actually contain things that are very, very similar across multiple dimensions. Like protons are like that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that distinguishes one proton from another, and the same with electrons. And, you know, the set of triangles is like that because you can define it precisely. But most of the categories that human beings use aren't so neat, and the problem with that is that unless the categories are neat, like scientific categories, it's very difficult to investigate them scientifically. So, for example, you might do research on a group of people with anxiety disorders, but the problem with that is that the anxiety disorder category is so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to identify the commonalities across all the people who are in that category, and that's partly because the category isn't actually a scientific category. It's a hybrid category. It's a practical category. I can give you an example of that. No, I can't because I must not have saved it. Anyways, many of the DSM categories, so these are categories for psychopathology, require, if you're part of that category, imagine there's 7 symptoms that you could have, or 8 symptoms that you could have that would put you in that category, like antisocial personality. 8 symptoms: you steal, you kick, you hit, you bite, you you know, you're abusive. I don't remember the categories precisely, but you can be in the category if you have symptoms 2 through 5, and you can be in the category if you have symptoms 6 through 8. They aren't the same symptoms, but you're in the same category. And you think, well, how the hell can that be? Well, that's a family resemblance category, roughly speaking, and lots of the things that we use are family resemblance categories. There's a prototype, and then if you have enough of the features of that prototype, imagine the prototype has 10 features, and if you have 6 of those features, you get to be in that category. But it means that the category is actually quite diverse, and that's one of the problems that plagues psychiatry as a science and clinical psychology as a science. It's a really big problem, because if the categories aren't homogeneous, then it's very difficult to draw conclusions about the members of the category. And the psychologists and the psychiatrists claim that those are scientific categories, but they're not, and they can't be, partly because they're aimed at the classification of health or ideal versus non-health or non-ideal, and partly because they play multiple roles, eh? I mean, the category isn't there just to provide neat demarcations for scientific study. The category is there to give people a language to talk about certain sets of symptoms, to diagnose, because, you know, when you come in and you have a set of symptoms, you might want to know what they are, so that you also know what they aren't. It's really a relief often to find a diagnosis. And then, of course, the diagnosis has certain implications for treatment and for billing and for all of that, so the category has to play all of those roles. So there's multiple types of category, and the categories that we're talking about in relationship to mythology aren't scientific categories. They're categories about the world construed as a place to act. So here's a way to think about it. You're always looking at the world through a framework of reference, and you have to do that because there isn't very much of you. You can't see the whole world at once, and in fact the amount of the world you actually see is so small you can't believe it. The central part of your vision is zipping around, producing a pretty high resolution representation of exactly what you're looking at, but outside of that center, like if I look at you, I can't see her eyes. I can see her glasses, but barely. I can't even tell whether you're male or female. The person past that, I can't see at all. Now you don't notice that, you know. You don't notice that you're that blind because your central vision is always popping around, illuminating that tiny space. But you're so damn blind, it's just mind-boggling. And I'm sure some of you have seen the Invisible Gorilla video, you know, where a gorilla comes into the video and you don't notice, which is somewhat shocking because you would think that you would notice a gorilla. But what happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. And because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception. Bloody well think about that for a minute. That's a Buddhist idea, right? People live in a kind of illusion, and sometimes that illusion causes suffering, and they can transform the way they look at the world, and that can release them from their suffering. But the idea that you do live in an illusion, well, I don't know if it's exactly an illusion, but you certainly do live within a framework of perception that's determined by your values. Now that is so weird, you know, because we never think of the world as something that reveals itself through our values. But of course it does, because you look at what you want. You aim at what you want, and once you've aimed, the world lays itself out for you, and that's exactly how perception works. That's why I represented it this way. You're always somewhere, that's point A, and that's somewhere in some place in some time, and you always have some notion about what you want to have happen next. You know, you're going to go to the next class maybe, you've got a plan after this. In this class you have a plan, you're hoping to learn something, I presume, and maybe you have a goal with regards to a grade, and that's nested inside your desire to get a degree, and that's nested inside your desire to be educated and to have a career and have a successful life. So attending to me at the moment, the reason you're doing that is because all of those values exist within you simultaneously, focusing your attention. And so you're attending to me and not to something else, assuming that all of you with your computers open aren't surfing the web, which you might be, but assuming that you're focusing, whatever you're focusing on is directed by what you value. And some of that can be unconscious. In fact, a lot of it is unconscious, because you know it's very difficult for you to get control of what you pay attention to. You know what that's like. You're trying to study, it's kind of a boring paper. Christ, your attention is just like everywhere, you know. Maybe you'll vacuum under the bed instead of doing the reading the paper, you know. You can't get a grip on that thing, so your attention has an autonomy. And that's another psychoanalytic idea, you know, because you kind of think, well, you're in control. It's like, really? You ever try telling yourself what to do? How does that work for you? I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. Right, sure you are. Yeah, I'm going to quit eating sugar for a month. It's like, how long does that last? It's like 15 minutes, and you're eating like 3 chocolate bars.
Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible, and then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters.
Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun, because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. Things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and you know, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And you know, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. You know, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish around, and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so that's in keeping with Jung's idea about erasing once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. Now, sometimes you don't know how to do that. So you might say, imagine you're walking down Bloor Street and there's this guy who's like alcoholic and schizophrenic and has been on the streets for 10 years. He sort of stumbles towards you and, you know, incoherently mutters something. That's a problem. And it would be good if you could fix it, but you haven't got a clue about how to fix that. You just walk around that and go find something that you could fix, because if you muck about in that, not only is it unlikely that you'll help that person, it's very likely that you'll get hurt yourself. So, you know, just because while you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You know, you don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, you know, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You know, you go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask. And things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. You know, the best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team, and while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, you know, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it. Because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people. But it's still a great thing to ask.
You know, if you don't know what you should do with your life, you don't know who you should be, sometimes you think about that as what career you should pursue. But here's another way of thinking about it. It's kind of a SEAL's ethos that Congressman Crenshaw detailed out. Here's some things you could be. Those are my words. These are his. You'll be someone who's never late. You will be someone who takes care of his men, gets to know them, and puts their needs before yours. You will be someone who does not quit in the face of adversity. You will be someone who takes charge and leads when no one else will. You will be detail-oriented, which you discuss a lot in later sections of the book, always vigilant, attentive. You will be aggressive in your actions, but never lose your cool. You will have a sense of humor, because sometimes that is all that can get you through the darkest hours. You will work hard and perform, even when no one is watching. You'll be creative and think outside the box, even if it gets you in trouble. You're a rebel, but not a mutineer. You are a jack of all trades and master of none. And then you follow that a little later with this paragraph, these paragraphs. Be aggressive enough to kill the enemy, but immediately calm enough not to scare the little old lady. You'll be that man who's mentally tough enough to operate in horrific chaos, then immediately transition to tranquility, all without mentally breaking. You will effectively transition from hyper-masculine aggressor to gentle caretaker. You'll be both a warrior and a gentleman. The qualities that made SEAL leaders great were rarely physical in nature. They listened. They empowered their team to be successful, carefully entrusting individuals with additional responsibility. It's a real conservative ethos there. They highlighted good performance publicly and criticized bad performance privately. And so, well, you know, those are lists of virtues, and maybe they're not the only list of possible virtues, probably not. But if you're lost and you don't know where to start, practicing, you know, you also talk about this idea that, this is an Aristotelian idea, you know, that we are our habits. We become what we practice. And imagine if you're lost and you're listening, you think, well, you find some things admirable. Well, you could practice those things, and you can practice them locally. And minimally in your own relationships, and you can start to get good at them. And as you get good at them, well, you get better at them, right? And then you can broaden out the scope of your action into a wider purview. So you said here too, let's go for another quote here. Throughout your life, this is very practical advice too, and I think it's very wise from a therapeutic perspective. Throughout your life, you have people you look up to. Okay, so let's think about that. You look up. What does that mean? Why up? Well, up is something that beckons from a distance. It's like a light on a hill, and we automatically assume that those who we admire are people we look up to. So that specifies a distance and a direction, and it's uphill. It's up toward a higher vista, let's say. So there are automatically people who elicit that spirit in you. You have noticed the way.
It might also imply that there's some sense of struggle required to get to that point, because it's easier to go downhill than it is uphill.
Yes, definitely. That's right. It's an uphill trek. And it also implies judgment, because if someone's above you, then they also serve as a judge, or you serve as a judge in relationship to them, because you compare yourself unfavorably with them. And that can also inspire you to tear them down. That's really the story of Cain and Abel, and that's a major story. You have noticed the way a teacher, parent, coworker, mentor, or friend interacts with others, and you come away thinking, that behavior simply works better. They are respected, admired, and successful. And you find yourself wondering why that is. You do if you're a little bit humble instead of being envious, right? Because otherwise you think, well, that damn crook, he just stole his position, and that's why he's got it. But if you're a bit humble, you might think, well, no, that guy looks successful. Maybe he knows something I don't. You are noticing attributes and character traits that are good and worth aspiring to. You are noticing attributes that make certain people more successful than others. You are noticing what a hero looks like. And in the process, you are discovering a path made up of desirable personality traits that helps you ascend in social hierarchies. That's Jacob's ladder, by the way. That ladder that is the hierarchy to the good. That's the vision Jacob has of the pathway to God, is that it's a hierarchical structure with the thing that's ultimately good at the pinnacle, by definition, right? The best of all possible goods. And then there are intermediary structures all the way up, and beings inhabiting those structures. And this isn't metaphysical. It's like if you find someone you admire, the reason you admire them is because they're higher up in that heavenly hierarchy, so to speak, than you are. And your whole nervous system tells you that. You're compelled to listen, you're compelled to pay attention by the action of your own unconscious mind.
You know, what's interesting about this point of identifying these heroes or at least role models, you can call them either one. I just thought heroes was a more compelling word to use for the sake of writing it. But what's interesting about it too is how pop culture actually plays a pretty important part of this, because like there's plenty of people who simply don't have these good role models in their lives, and you have to acknowledge that. And so where are they supposed to turn? And it's maybe one of the reasons that it's so important to fight these cultural wars that you and I engage in on a fairly regular basis, that they become a serious part of our politics, which at the same time is necessary, but also deeply, deeply unfortunate. I do think the attack on pop culture from this progressive victimhood left has reached a ceiling. I think there's a serious backlash. You look at movies like Top Gun, the recent one, Top Gun, maybe like the highest grossing of all time. Absolutely phenomenal movie, really fun to watch. Why? Because it just had all of these classical virtues infused within it, about relationships and about how you treat people and what the consequences are for treating people as such. That these things speak to people in a deeper way. They can't necessarily articulate them, but they understand it when they see it. And there's these sort of radical minorities that are very loud that want that changed. You know, they want something else to be on that hill. But people react against it because it's not true. There's no truth to that.
And something cries out from inside of them then, and that can be appealed to by a storyteller. I saw the same thing in the Marvel Avengers series, is that there is a return to any wide range of classical virtues, certainly brotherhood, a kind of a military ethos, sacrifice, a striving upward, certainly masculine virtues, the combination of the Hulk and Iron Man, for example, there's a monstrous element to the Hulk, but he's a hero in a strange sense, and he's also the revitalizing force for Iron Man when he just about dies, and that's all. The reason those movies were so necessary and so attractive is because they are, in fact, addressing a radical conceptual void in the culture, and it's a void that you're addressing in your book, especially with your appeal, trifold appeal, let's say, to duty, responsibility, and humor at the same time, right? Which is a kind of stoicism in the face of catastrophe. Because this is a big problem in life. Imagine you're aiming for something and then something happens to make it impossible, or you find out that it's the wrong thing because you were aiming in the wrong direction. Well, so then what do you have to rely on to set you right? It's not your aim, obviously, but it might be your capacity to take new aim, and that's bloody well dependent on your character. That's for sure. And so I don't think there is a more fundamental aim than what you should be, and there's no better way of characterizing what you should be than that you should fortify your character.